There are stories from World War II they never wanted you to hear. Hidden in classified files, erased from textbooks, buried in frozen wastelands and shattered cities, these aren't tales of glory. They're warnings. What you're about to see was sealed away for a reason. Open this box, and the past won't just speak, it will haunt. The wind howled over the icy ridges of northern Greenland, where the sun vanished for months and the aurora whispered above like a silent sentinel. In December 1942, 12 men and women, a mix of American naval personnel, meteorologists, cryptographers, and Inuit guides, stood alone at the edge of the world. Their mission was simple but vital: operate Outpost WWII, a top-secret Allied weather station tasked with monitoring Arctic patterns that directly impacted bombing campaigns and, most critically, the planned invasion of Western Europe. Captain Lewis Morgan, a former professor of climatology at Yale turned naval officer, commanded the operation. With him was Lieutenant Sarah Coyle, a codebreaker from the Office of Naval Intelligence, sent to intercept any Luftwaffe transmissions from across the Atlantic. The other personnel included wireless operator Harold Fry, 2 engineers, and an Inuit father-son duo, Kakartok and Nuna, who guided the team across unforgiving terrain and taught them how to survive temperatures that regularly plunged below -40°F. The world forgot them, or so it seemed. But 3,000 miles away, deep within the Kriegsmarine's headquarters in Berlin, another operation was unfolding. German intelligence had learned of unusual radio activity emanating from Greenland. Believing it to be a weather station, Admiral Donitz approved Operation Schneesturm, a covert sabotage mission utilizing U-boat U-247 to deploy a team of elite German commandos on Greenland's coast. On January 6, 1943, Outpost WWII detected a strange blip in their sonar net, something moving beneath the ice floes. They suspected a drifting whale pod, perhaps a school of narwhals. Only Fry and Nuna were uneasy. "Whales don't stay near steel," Nuna whispered, face pale as the tundra. That night, Fry picked up a brief, sharp burst on the emergency channel. Morse code, but in a German hand. 3 days later, a storm blew in with blinding fury, masking the arrival of the saboteurs. The 6-man German team, led by Oberleutnant Klaus Dietrich, was brutal and efficient. They moved inland on skis with camouflage gear and silent Sten guns, aiming to reach the station under cover of darkness and demolish its radio tower, fuel stores, and any evidence of Allied presence. But the Inuit guides were watching. Nuna spotted ski tracks where none should be. He and his father followed them, evading detection and returning with news. 6 men, armed. Wrong colors. Morgan immediately ordered a lockdown. Barricades were hastily erected, perimeters rigged with tripwire flares. Coyle decoded intercepted whispers: "I station, Zerstoren, Schnell." No doubt remained. On January 11th, the Germans struck. The initial assault was swift. The fuel cache was blown, sending a plume of black smoke into the white sky. 2 engineers died instantly. Fry was shot through the chest while trying to send a distress signal. But the defenders fought back. Morgan and Coyle led a counter-ambush from the observatory ridge, using old hunting rifles and scavenged weapons. Kakartok, with his knowledge of terrain and weather, lured 2 Germans into an ice crevice they never climbed out of. A brutal standoff followed, lasting 42 hours. In sub-zero silence, bullets cracked through the air like whip snaps. Rations froze solid. Blood crystallized on white snow. Dietrich's team dwindled to 3, then 2. The Germans hadn't anticipated the cold, nor the resilience of a team who had lived in it for months. Coyle took a bullet to the thigh but kept relaying intelligence, tapping out enemy positions to nearby air bases in Newfoundland. She was the one who intercepted Dietrich's final transmission: "Ziel gescheitert. Kein Rückweg." Objective failed. No retreat. By January 14th, only 3 remained at the station: Captain Morgan, Sarah Coyle, and Nuna. Of the Germans, only Dietrich had survived, wounded and frostbitten. Rather than execute him, Morgan did something unexpected. He had Nuna help drag him into a tent and tend to his wounds. "When this war is over," Morgan told him, "we'll all have to explain why we did what we did." The rescue plane arrived 2 days later, summoned by Coil's last transmission. The survivors were airlifted to Reykjavik, then later to London. Operation Thule X was officially classified, buried beneath intelligence reports and red tape. The station was abandoned, consumed slowly by drifting ice and time. Nuna returned to his village. Morgan died in a plane crash a year later en route to a posting in Alaska. Coil continued her service with the ONI and eventually testified at the Nuremberg trials. Dietrich, handed over to British custody, never spoke of Greenland again. He died in prison in 1956. In 1997, a retired Canadian geologist trekking across Greenland stumbled upon rusted radio parts, shattered glass, and a frozen notebook sealed in waxed leather. Inside, scrawled in faded pencil, were the words, **, ice burns colder than fire. We held the line with frozen hands. Let them know we were here. **. It was signed, Lieutenant Sarah Coil. The city of Stalingrad was no longer a city. By December 1942, it had become a frozen skeleton of shattered factories, scorched apartment blocks, and cratered roads. Smoke clung to the Volga like a ghost refusing to pass on. Somewhere in that graveyard of Soviet resilience and German ambition, a 19-year-old Red Army sniper named Mikhail Arkhanov dragged a blood-stained violin case through the rubble, as distant artillery hummed a dirge. Mikhail had once played in the Volgograd Youth Orchestra. His older sister, Tatiana, had been a celebrated prodigy, a violinist of extraordinary grace. She had taught him to read music before he could read words. When the German Luftwaffe turned Stalingrad's Central Conservatory to ash in September, Tatiana was inside, performing for wounded troops. Her body was never recovered. Mikhail, serving on the southern bank, found only the crushed remains of her violin. Or so he thought. 3 weeks later, on a reconnaissance sweep through the bombed-out sector known to the Soviets as Sector K-12, Mikhail stumbled across a partially collapsed basement that had once been part of the conservatory. There, half buried in concrete and ash, was a battered red violin. The varnish was charred, the strings torn, but the shape unmistakable. He recognized Tatiana's initials etched faintly into the neck. Somehow, against logic and war, her violin had survived. He took it with him, an absurd gesture amid the slaughter, but it became his talisman. His unit, part of the 62nd Army, held what remained of the northern industrial sector. The Germans called it the meat grinder. Days passed without food, weeks without warmth. Snipers ruled the city. Mikhail earned a name among his comrades. The composer, not for his music, but for how silently he composed death through his Mosin-Nagant rifle. Then came the night everything changed. In January 1943, during a rare lull in the fighting, Mikhail found shelter in a shell-torn church that had once housed a concert piano. There he heard something he hadn't heard in months. Music. Faint, halting, almost broken. Piano keys, struck gently. He readied his rifle and crept toward the sound. In the cold shadows, seated on a collapsed pew with bloody bandages around his ribs, was a wounded German soldier playing the remnants of a piano with one hand. Mikhail's rifle rose on instinct, but the music stopped him. The soldier looked up. He didn't reach for a weapon. Instead, he raised his other hand slowly and said in perfect Russian, "No fight, just music." His name was Erich Bauer, a pianist from Dresden, pressed into the Wehrmacht's 6th Army and recently wounded by grenade shrapnel. He had become separated from his unit and crawled into the church to die. Mikhail should have shot him. Orders were clear. But the violin on his back seemed to pull his hand down. He sat across from Erich in silence. Then, without a word, he opened the violin case. The strings were patched with scavenged wire. The bow was crude. But the sound, raspy, haunted, rose like smoke. Together, they played Bach. Then Tchaikovsky. Then silence again. Over the next 10 nights, Mikhail visited the church. They played in whispers. Erich showed him how to improvise, how to bend rhythm into grief. Mikhail taught Erich Russian lullabies. Each day, Mikhail returned to the front, killing men Eric might have once marched with. But in the dark hours, they made music. They never spoke of the dead. Then, on the 11th night, Soviet MPs discovered the church. Eric was dragged out into the snow. Mikhail was arrested for aiding the enemy. His commanding officer, a steely-eyed commissar named Dmitry Kalash, interrogated him in the gutted remnants of City Hall. "You played music with a Nazi?" Kalash hissed, disbelief dripping from every syllable. "He was a pianist," Mikhail answered. "And he didn't ask me to stop." Kalash ordered Eric's execution for espionage. Mikhail protested, not for politics, but for decency. "He killed no one. He only played." The commissar hesitated. There were no witnesses. No civilians left to hear lies or truths. Instead of immediate execution, Kalash made Mikhail a deal. "You'll return to the front. You'll kill 10 Germans. Then we erase this performance. If you die, it never happened. If you live, you forget it ever did." Mikhail agreed. He left the violin in the church. For the next month, he became a fury. 10 confirmed kills. Then 20. Then 50. He survived until the German surrender in February. When the war ended, Mikhail returned to Stalingrad, what was left of it, and found the church reduced to rubble. Eric was gone. Dead, perhaps. Perhaps not. Mikhail kept the violin. He never spoke of the pianist again, not to his comrades, not to his wife, not even to his children. But every winter, on the anniversary of the German surrender, he would take out the red violin, now restored, and play one song, *Pavon pour un infante defunt star. A lament for a lost child, or a lost sister, or perhaps a lost enemy who became, for a brief time, a friend. Decades later, in 1986, Mikhail Arkhanov died peacefully in his sleep. Among his possessions was the violin, a notebook of transcribed compositions, and a faded photograph of the ruined church. On the back, in careful German script, were the words, "For Mikhail, der den Tod mit Musik zahmt." For Mikhail, who tamed death with music. The violin now rests behind glass in the Volgograd War Museum, labeled only, "Instrument recovered from Stalingrad, 1943. Player unknown." The rolling hills of Carmarthenshire, Wales, seemed a world away from the roar of Luftwaffe bombers and the thunder of tanks in Tunisia. Yet beneath the gentle green surface of that countryside, inside a converted wool mill guarded by sheep and secrecy, a group of teenage girls were quietly breaking the backbone of the Kriegsmarine. The world would never know their names, until long after their war was over. The operation was called Willow, a covert initiative under British naval intelligence. In 1941, as Bletchley Park grew increasingly overwhelmed with encrypted German naval traffic, MI6 sought to expand its code-breaking network. But rather than build another sprawling base filled with top graduates and academics, they tried something radical, training rural schoolgirls in cryptography, buried deep in the Welsh countryside where prying eyes would never suspect. The mill, known locally as Year Hen Phelan, had once produced blankets. Now it buzzed with typewriters, radios, and chalkboards filled with cipher wheels and trigraphs. Overseen by the no-nonsense Professor Mildred Hughes, a cryptanalyst and linguist who had once lectured at Cambridge, Operation Willow began with just 10 girls between the ages of 14 and 17. They were the daughters of miners, postmen, and farmers, selected not for status, but for aptitude in languages and logic. The training was brutal. 16-hour days filled with Morse code drills, frequency analysis, and simulated cipher games. Mistakes were punished with silence and extra shifts. There were no uniforms, only brown cardigans and braided hair. Most had never left Wales, never heard German spoken aloud. Within 6 months, they were decrypting segments of U-boat communications pulled from transatlantic listening posts. Their breakthrough came in November 1942. Intercepts from a relay station in Ireland had picked up strange variations in standard Enigma naval traffic, odd duplications, fragmented patterns. Professor Hughes suspected a new variant of the cipher rotor sequence used exclusively by U-boats operating near Gibraltar. The signals came encoded in what looked like gibberish. But 16-year-old Gwyneth Ellis, a coal miner's daughter from Merthyr Tydfil, noticed something. She had a strange obsession with nursery rhymes, and the rhythm of the intercepted cipher reminded her of a skipping song, "Three blind mice, see how they run." That nonsensical insight cracked the door. Over the next 5 days, Gwyneth and her team worked in complete isolation, building rotor replicas out of wood, pencil stubs, and borrowed typewriter ribbons. Using analog methods that mirrored the more advanced bomb machines at Bletchley, they successfully decrypted 4 complete German messages. The content was chilling. A U-boat wolfpack, codenamed Iceflam, was planning a coordinated ambush on Allied convoys supporting Operation Torch, the invasion of North Africa. The messages revealed positions, timing, and even flaws in the German coordination strategy. MI6 passed the intelligence to the Admiralty. Within 48 hours, the Royal Navy rerouted multiple convoys and launched a counter-interception operation. 3 U-boats were sunk. Over 2,000 Allied lives were spared. None of the Willow girls ever knew the full impact of what they had done. Their reward? Silence. Operation Willow remained unacknowledged even within British intelligence circles. The girls were told to destroy all notes and return to civilian studies. The wool mill was decommissioned. Professor Hughes was reassigned to a psychological warfare division and disappeared from public record. The girls were scattered, their records sealed under the Official Secrets Act. But the story didn't die. In 2001, the great-nephew of Gwyneth Ellis, researching family history for a school project, stumbled upon a diary hidden beneath a floorboard in his grandmother's house. Inside were detailed accounts of cipher patterns, shift schedules, and crude sketches of rotor mechanisms. The diary included names, code words, and a poetic dedication, asterisk, for the 9 who wove silence into song and stopped death in its tracks, without ever pulling a trigger. Asterisk. The diary sparked inquiries that led to a parliamentary review. Documents long buried in MI6 archives were unsealed. Operation Willow was officially recognized in 2005. By then, only 2 of the original girls were still alive. Gwyneth Ellis, living in a small cottage near Aberystwyth, gave a single interview to the BBC. Frail, sharp-eyed, and amused by all the attention, she said, "We were just girls who did our homework. The enemy happened to be listening." When asked if she regretted keeping silent all those years, she smiled gently. "We didn't need medals. We had the code." Today, a bronze plaque marks the site of Year Hen Phelan. It reads, "To the girls of Operation Willow, who cracked the code and kept the world from cracking." Their story remains a footnote in the grand narrative of Bletchley and Ultra. But in the quiet hills of Wales, the echo of typewriter keys and the whispers of young minds can still be felt, if you know where to listen. High above the valley floor, where the twisted vineyards of Basilicata clung to the dark volcanic soil, the ruins of an old monastery sat in defiant silence. Its broken bell tower overlooked Monte Vulture, a dormant volcano whose name whispered through local legends. But during the final years of the Second World War, the name would gain new meaning, one feared by Nazi officers and fascist collaborators alike. They called them I Lupi Neri, the Black Wolves. The story begins in September 1943, shortly after the armistice between Italy and the Allied powers. Chaos rippled across the Italian peninsula as German forces flooded south, occupying territory once held by their former ally. Mussolini's puppet state, the Italian Social Republic, clamped down on resistance with brutal repression. In the mountains of southern Italy, small villages were left to fend for themselves, cut off from Rome, ignored by Berlin, and considered too remote by the Allies to bother liberating. In this vacuum, the wolves were born. At their center was Alessandro Rinaldi, a former seminary student turned labor organizer who had fled Mussolini's black shirts years earlier. He returned to his native village of Rapone under a false name, only to find it occupied by a fascist militia looting farms and abducting men for forced labor. Enraged, he climbed Monte Vulture and began gathering allies. Among them were Don Pietro Montesi, an elderly priest who disguised his rifle beneath his cassock, Giulia Farina, a nurse whose brother had been executed by the Germans, and Corporal Thomas Green, a British paratrooper who had escaped from a POW camp near Salerno. By October, their group had grown to over 30 fighters, armed with scavenged rifles, hand grenades, and hunting knives. The name came after their first ambush. In the fog-covered woods below Rio Nero, the group sabotaged a supply convoy carrying ammunition to German troops stationed at Potenza. They struck like wolves, fast, brutal, and vanishing into the trees. The fascist radio network broadcast furious warnings, "Beware the lupi neri who prowl the south." But the wolves didn't just attack military targets. They also smuggled food into starving villages, rescued downed Allied pilots, and assassinated local informants working for the Gestapo. They communicated using coded messages etched into wine barrels and church hymnals. Their headquarters was a network of hidden caves formed centuries earlier by volcanic activity. The defining moment of the Black Wolves came in early 1944, during Operation Midnight Harvest. Through intercepted messages passed to them by sympathetic railway workers, the Wolves learned that a heavily armed German train, codenamed Führerzug 17, would be moving a cache of panzer fuel and artillery shells from Naples to reinforce the Anzio front. If successful, the train's arrival could devastate the already fragile Allied beachhead. Sabotaging a train in Axis territory was suicide. Still, Rinaldi knew the route. It would pass through the narrow Candellara tunnel beneath Monte Vulture. If they could collapse the entrance and trap the train inside, they could delay the shipment by days, maybe weeks. The plan required precision. Corporal Green designed the demolition charges using stolen explosives from a sabotaged German outpost. Julia posed as a washerwoman to gain access to the station house and mapped the train's schedule. Don Pietro gave last rites to all 37 partisans the night before the mission, though he carried a pistol under his robe. At 3:17 a.m. on February 2nd, the wolves struck. They blew the northern tunnel entrance as the train passed inside. Panic followed. The Germans tried to reverse out, but the blast had warped the rails. A firefight erupted at the southern mouth, where wolves waited in ambush. 24 Germans were killed. The rest surrendered. One of them was a Waffen-SS officer carrying detailed orders from Kesselring himself. The train never reached Anzio. The Allies advanced 4 days later. Revenge, however, was swift. The Gestapo stormed local villages, executing civilians suspected of aiding the partisans. Rapone lost 13 men in a single day. In retaliation, the Wolves launched a campaign of terror against fascist collaborators, burning outposts, poisoning supply caches, and ambushing patrols at night. The mountain became a ghost-haunted place, cursed by Nazi superstition. Few dared climb it without armor. In June 1944, Allied forces finally pushed into southern Italy. An American infantry division met the Wolves near Melfi. The soldiers were stunned. They expected a ragged band of irregulars. Instead, they found a coordinated, disciplined unit complete with field medics, encryption codes, and radio scouts. When offered integration into the formal Italian resistance command, Rinaldi refused. "We are not soldiers," he told a British officer. "We are wolves. We don't fight wars. We protect our own." After the war, I lupi neri faded into folklore. Rinaldi returned to anonymity, becoming a schoolteacher. Julia founded a rural clinic. Don Pietro died in 1951, still preaching sermons spiced with quiet references to liberty and sacrifice. Corporal Green, the only non-Italian in the Wolves, returned to Manchester with a cane, a chest full of medals, and a tattoo of a black wolf paw across his shoulder. For years, he sent letters to the Rinaldi family every Christmas, though none were returned. The story of the Black Wolves might have vanished entirely if not for the discovery of the Candellara Notebook in 1989. A group of hikers exploring the tunnel ruins found a sealed metal canister inside a collapsed crevice. Inside was a journal, written in code, with sketches of train layouts, tunnel maps, and mission logs. It ended with a single phrase in bold, unencrypted Latin. Asterisk, lupus non dormit. Libertas aeternam vigit. Asterisk, asterisk, the wolf does not sleep. Liberty lives forever. Asterisk. The notebook now sits in Rome's Museo della Resistenza. In the background of its exhibit plays a grainy, silent clip of three people standing on a mountain ridge, one in a priest's robe, one with a medical armband, and one holding a Lee-Enfield rifle. They look toward the horizon, where black smoke curls from a wrecked train far below. On April 4, 1945, a Mitsubishi Zero aircraft, white chrysanthemum painted on its wings, peeled away from formation just seconds before impact. It was part of a kamikaze squadron targeting the USS Bunker Hill off the coast of Okinawa. The pilot, Lieutenant Hiroshi Takeda, was never seen again by his comrades. Japanese records listed him as Kia in Divine Mission. American radar tracked his plane vanishing toward a small, unnamed island southeast of Okinawa. For decades, no one knew what happened to him. Hiroshi Takeda had grown up in Nagasaki, the son of a quiet schoolteacher and a mother who worked in a kimono shop. He had studied literature at Kyoto University before being drafted into the Imperial Japanese Navy in 1943. Reserved and thoughtful, he showed early promise as a pilot. But where others boasted of glory and sacrifice, Hiroshi remained silent. He was often found reading poetry in the barracks rather than engaging in militaristic songs or sword drills. By late 1944, Japan's war effort had become desperate. Aircraft carriers were sunk, cities burned, and fuel was scarce. The Kamikaze program, initially reserved for volunteers, began to seek strongly encouraged recruits. Hiroshi was among the chosen. He never voiced dissent, never resisted. But on the day he received his final orders, his bunkmate found a copy of The Tale of the Heike beside his pillow, bookmarked at a line, asterisk, "The proud do not endure. They are like the dream of a spring night." Asterisk. On April 4th, after a final ceremony where pilots sipped sake and received white headbands bearing the rising sun, Hiroshi climbed into his Zero. His target was the deck of the Bunker Hill. His route was memorized, his fuel was measured for a one-way trip. But something happened during that final dive. Survivors aboard the carrier recalled the moment clearly. 4 planes descended from the clouds. 3 struck. 1 curved upward, then banked east, vanishing into the haze. American gunners didn't fire, too stunned, perhaps, or unsure if it was a trick. Black smoke and screams filled the deck. But the ghost plane never returned. Hiroshi crash-landed on a rocky islet, its shoreline jagged and pounded by surf. The plane shattered, but he survived with a broken arm and a gash across his temple. For 3 days, he lay unconscious in a cave. When he woke, he found himself surrounded by villagers, Okinawans, mostly women and elderly men, who had hidden in coastal caves to escape the fighting. At first, they feared him. His uniform bore the mark of the emperor. But he was injured, unarmed, and spoke with the soft tone of a scholar, not a warrior. A widowed herbalist named Ye cared for him. She never asked why he had turned from death. He never offered an answer. As weeks passed, Hiroshi grew close to the villagers. He helped gather food, mended fishing nets with his one good hand, and listened to their stories. Tales of Japanese soldiers taking food at bayonet point, of homes burned to prevent American landings, of the horror that fell equally from sky and sea. At night, he would stand alone on the cliffs, looking toward the mainland, where fire danced on the horizon. When American forces landed on Okinawa, the villagers feared the worst. But Hiroshi convinced them to surrender peacefully. He walked barefoot down to the shore with a white flag fashioned from a fishing sail. The soldiers arrested him, confused by his appearance. They found the remains of his uniform, the damage to his aircraft, and a journal filled with poetry, prayers, and sketches of faces from the island. He was sent to a POW camp in Saipan. There, he remained silent during interrogations. When asked why he didn't complete his mission, he gave only one answer, asterisk, "I wanted to die, but not like that." Asterisk. After the war, Hiroshi was transferred to Tokyo, where a covert Allied review board debriefed former kamikaze pilots and military personnel. Only 2 known cases of aborted suicide missions were ever documented. Hiroshi's testimony was unique. He didn't denounce Japan, nor did he glorify the empire. He simply stated that death without thought was dishonor, not heroism. He was released in 1947, but by then, Japan had changed beyond recognition. Cities were ash, the emperor's voice had cracked through radios across the land, and the soul of a nation had been buried under surrender terms and occupation orders. Hiroshi never returned to Nagasaki. Instead, he moved to the remote island of Yakushima, where he lived alone, working as a lighthouse keeper. He rarely spoke of the war. Once a year, he sent an anonymous donation to a hospital in Okinawa. Sometimes he mailed letters to no return address, written entirely in classical Japanese verse. In 1994, a graduate student researching post-war isolation came across one of Hiroshi's poems published anonymously in a local newspaper. It read, "I turned from flame toward waves that did not judge me. Now the sun sets slow." The student tracked him down and asked for an interview. Hiroshi, then 71, agreed, on one condition, that nothing be published until after his death. In the interview, he admitted that he still dreamed of the dive. That he sometimes heard the screams from the bunker hill in his sleep. "I took no lives," he said, "but I did not save any either. My flight was not redemption. It was delay." When asked what made him turn away, he gave only a single word, music. He explained that just before the dive, a memory surfaced, his younger sister playing the koto in spring, wind moving the paper doors. The sound returned to him, clear and fragile, and in that instant, the sky no longer looked like heaven. It looked like home. Hiroshi Takeda died in 1999. His will requested no funeral, no marker, only that his ashes be scattered in the sea near Okinawa. But when villagers from the islet heard of his passing, they erected a small stone on the cliffs where he had once stood. It reads, "Here stood one who flew to die, and instead, chose to live." Some stories were buried to protect reputations, others to hide mistakes, and a few, because the truth was too dangerous to remember. Now you've heard them. And once you know, you can't go back. History doesn't forget. It waits, just beneath the surface, for someone brave enough to dig it up.